They called her the Ghost. It was a name whispered in the shadows of the Blackwood pack, a cruel jest for a girl who was all but invisible. Alara existed in the periphery, a smudge of gray against the vibrant life of the pack. She was the Omega, the lowest of the low, a living specter tasked with the duties no one else wanted. Today, that duty was scrubbing the Great Hall's flagstones, a task made agonizing by the winter that had sunk its teeth deep into the mountains. The cold was a physical thing. It seeped through the threadbare wool of her tunic, through the worn leather of her boots, and settled deep in her bones. Each splash of icy water from the bucket felt like a fresh sting, her hands already raw and split, the skin a mottled red and blue. She kept her head down, her world reduced to the grimy stone in front of her, the harsh scrape of the brush, and the biting scent of lye. She was an orphan, a stray pup taken in out of some long-forgotten sense of pity after a rival pack had decimated her own. That pity had withered long ago, leaving only a brittle tolerance in its wake. She was a burden, a mouth to feed that offered nothing in return, for she had never undergone the change. She was 20, and still her wolf slept, a silence within her that branded her as broken, worthless. A pair of fine leather boots stopped beside her bucket, interrupting the rhythm of her work. Alara didn't need to look up. She knew the scent of expensive perfume and casual cruelty. Lyra, the Alpha's daughter. "Still scrubbing, little ghost?" Lyra's voice was like honey laced with shards of glass. "You missed a spot." The toe of her boot nudged a perfectly clean stone. Alara's shoulders hunched. She dipped the brush back into the freezing water, her knuckles screaming in protest, and scrubbed at the spot Lyra had indicated. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. She knew what was coming. It was always the same. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, Omega!" The command was sharp, a whip crack in the cold air. Slowly, Alara lifted her head. She kept her eyes fixed on the hem of Lyra's fur-lined cloak, unable to meet the other woman's mocking gaze. To meet her eyes was to invite a more direct form of torment. "Pathetic," Lyra sneered. A ripple of laughter came from the two sycophants who trailed her everywhere. "My father is hosting the patrols from the northern ridge tonight. The hall must be perfect. Do you understand? No smudges. Not from your dirty hands, not from your pathetic existence." Alara's throat was tight. She managed a small, jerky nod. "Use your words," Lyra hissed, her patience thinning. "Yes," Alara whispered. The word was a puff of white in the frigid air, barely audible. It was enough. Lyra kicked the bucket. Icy, foul water sloshed over the stones and soaked the front of Alara's tunic, drenching her to the skin. The shock of the cold was so intense it stole her breath. It felt like being stabbed with 1,000 frozen needles. A gasp escaped her lips, a sound of pure misery. "That's for the smudge you were about to leave," Lyra said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Clean it up, and be grateful we let a broken thing like you sleep under our roof at all." She swept away, her friends tittering behind her, their laughter echoing in the vast, empty hall. Alara remained on her knees, shivering violently. The wet wool clung to her skin, leaching away what little warmth she had. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and shameful, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give Lyra the satisfaction. Not that. Gritting her teeth against the chatter of her own jaw, she pushed a stray strand of mousy brown hair from her face with the back of her wrist. She would not break. She had endured this for 10 years. She would endure this now. She picked up her brush. Her hands were numb, clumsy things at the end of her arms, but she forced them to work, pushing the dirty water back toward the bucket. The fire in the great hearth at the far end of the hall seemed a world away, its warmth a promise meant for others. Her life was a litany of small pains and large humiliations, but deep inside, beneath the layers of shame and worthlessness, there was something else, a stubborn little ember that had never quite been extinguished, a refusal to completely surrender. It was the only thing that was truly hers. Hours later, the hall was finally clean, the stones gleaming in the firelight. The Northern Patrol had arrived, their deep voices and hearty laughter a stark contrast to the silence of her labor. She had been dismissed to the kitchens, to scrub pots until her arms ached, her reward a cold crust of bread and a lump of cheese. Now, huddled in her small alcove in the servants' quarters, a space barely larger than a coffin, she tried to find sleep. But the cold from her earlier drenching had settled into a deep, shaking chill she couldn't escape. The single, threadbare blanket she owned offered little comfort. Sleep was impossible. Her mind churned with the echoes of Lyra's laughter, the remembered sting of the icy water, the perpetual ache of her own inadequacy. Why was she like this? Why had her wolf never answered her call? The question was a constant, painful refrain in her mind. It was the source of all her misery, the reason she was an outcast in a society that valued strength and connection above all else. Suddenly, a commotion from outside shattered the relative quiet of the night. Shouts, the panicked ringing of the warning bell. It was a frantic, discordant sound that spoke of immediate danger. Alara sat up, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was not the sound of a drill. This was real. The door to the quarters burst open, and another servant, a boy named Finn, stumbled in, his face pale. "Rogues!" he gasped. "A whole pack of them, breaking through the western perimeter!" Panic erupted. Servants scrambled for hiding places, their fear a palpable scent in the small space. But Alara felt a different kind of fear. The western perimeter was near the infirmary, where the pack's youngest children were sheltered during the deep winter. Her mind flashed with an image of little Maya, the healer's daughter, who had once given Alara a wilted flower with a shy smile. She didn't think. For the first time in a long time, she simply acted. She scrambled from her alcove and ran, pushing past the others out into the biting chaos of the night. The wind sliced like claws, carrying the scent of blood and rage. The sounds of fighting were closer now, a brutal symphony of snarls and screams. Snow was beginning to fall, thick and fast, blurring the world into a frenzy of white and shadow. She had to get to the children. It was a desperate, foolish instinct, but it drove her forward. She was small, and in the swirling snow and chaos, she was all but invisible. She slipped through the fighting, a ghost in truth, her only focus the small wooden building on the edge of the compound. But the storm was turning into a blizzard with unnatural speed. The wind howled like a starving beast, tearing at her clothes and blinding her with snow. She lost her bearings, stumbling away from the main path and into the deeper drifts that bordered the forest. The sounds of the battle faded behind her, swallowed by the roaring gale. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced her desperate resolve. She was lost. The cold was no longer just a discomfort. It was a predator, sinking its fangs into her, draining the life from her limbs. Her shivering became uncontrollable. Her steps grew heavy, clumsy. She fell. Her face hit the snow, the impact jarring. For a moment, she just lay there, the strange warmth of encroaching hypothermia a seductive whisper in her mind. It would be so easy to close her eyes, so easy to just stop, to let the ghost fade away completely. No. The stubborn ember inside her flared. She would not die like this, not alone in the snow. With a groan, she pushed herself up, fighting against the crushing weight of the cold and her own exhaustion. She took one step, then another. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to move. She stumbled through the trees, the blizzard a white wall around her. And then she saw it. A break in the storm's fury. A small clearing strangely sheltered from the wind. And in the center of it, a shape. A massive, dark form slumped against the base of an ancient pine. Her first thought was that it was a bear. She froze, her heart seizing in her chest. But the scent on the air was not that of a beast. It was wolf, but deeper, older, and laced with the sharp, metallic tang of blood. So much blood. Drawn by a force she didn't understand, she moved closer. It was a man. Or something that had once been a man. He was enormous, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, clad in dark, travel-worn leathers. A great black cloak, trimmed with silver wolf fur, was dusted with snow. His head was bowed, and a mane of night-black hair obscured his face. A massive, brutal-looking axe lay on the ground beside him. But it was the wound that held her gaze. A deep, vicious gash ran across his side, dark and sluggishly bleeding. The snow around him was stained a horrifying crimson. He was dying. A tremor of fear went through her, but it was quickly replaced by something else. A strange, primal empathy. He was alone, just as she was. He was dying in the cold, just as she was. She couldn't leave him. Hesitantly, she took another step forward. "Hello?" she called out, her voice thin and reedy against the wind. The figure did not move. She thought he might already be dead. She crept closer still, her boots crunching in the snow. She reached out a trembling, half-frozen hand, intending to touch his shoulder, to check for any sign of life. The moment her fingertips brushed against the cold leather of his pauldron, the world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A tidal wave of energy slammed into her, a force so immense it felt like the mountain itself had struck her. Light, white and blinding, erupted behind her eyes. A searing heat shot up her arm, a pain so exquisite it was almost pleasure, and for a terrifying second, she felt her own soul being stripped bare. Every fear, every hope, every ounce of her miserable existence laid open for inspection. And she felt him. She felt his ancient loneliness, a chasm of solitude that spanned centuries. She felt his surprise, his disbelief, and then a surge of possessive, triumphant joy that was so powerful it nearly broke her. She snatched her hand back with a cry, stumbling backward and falling into the snow. The man's head snapped up, and she found herself staring into eyes of molten gold. They burned in the dim light, glowing with an inner fire that had nothing to do with the physical world. They were the eyes of a predator, of a king, of something ancient and utterly untamed. His face was harsh and beautiful, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, a face carved from granite and storm clouds. He was staring at her, not as if seeing a person, but as if seeing a miracle. The pain in her arm was a sharp, burning focus. She looked down at her hand. There, on the back of her wrist, a mark was forming. Lines of silver light swirled and coalesced, branding themselves into her skin. It was a complex, elegant symbol, like a stylized flame entwined with a crescent moon. It glowed with a soft, ethereal light before settling into a permanent silvery scar. What was happening? What was this? Her mind reeled with confusion and a terror so profound it eclipsed everything else. The man pushed himself away from the tree, a low groan of pain rumbling in his chest. But he got to his feet, swaying slightly, his golden eyes never leaving her. He was a giant, towering over her even in his injured state. He took a staggering step toward her. Alara scrambled backward, crab-walking through the snow, her breath coming in ragged, panicked sobs. "Stay away," she whimpered. He ignored her plea, his focus absolute. He took another step, his gaze dropping to the glowing mark on her wrist. A look of dawning, reverent awe crossed his harsh features. "You," he rasped, his voice a deep thunder that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. It was a voice accustomed to absolute command, yet it was laced with a fragile wonder. "It's you." He reached her, sinking to one knee in the snow before her. The movement was clearly agonizing, but he didn't seem to care. He reached out a hand, a large, calloused hand that could have snapped her in two, and gently, so gently, cupped her face. His thumb stroked her cheek. The contact was another jolt, but this one was different. It wasn't the violent explosion of the first touch. This was warmth. A deep, pervasive heat that spread from his skin to hers, chasing away the deadly chill that had claimed her. It sank into her bones, into her soul, a feeling of coming home to a place she had never known. Her shivering stopped. Her body responded instinctively, leaning into his touch, craving the impossible warmth he offered. But her mind was still screaming. Who was this man? What was this mark? What was this feeling? It was too much, overwhelming. "I've been waiting," he murmured, his golden eyes searching her face, drinking her in. "For so long." Tears, the ones she had held back from Lyra, now streamed freely down her face. They were tears of fear, of confusion, of a hope so terrifying she couldn't bear it. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. His smile was like the first sunrise after a long winter. It transformed his harsh face into something devastatingly beautiful. "You will." He looked again at her wrist, then at his own bleeding side. His strength was clearly failing. "We need to," he faltered, his eyes glazing over with pain. He started to collapse. Without thinking, Alara lunged forward, catching him. His weight was immense, driving her back into the snow, but she wrapped her thin arms around his massive shoulders, trying to hold him up. Her face was pressed against his chest, and she could feel the frantic, weakening beat of his heart. "Mine," he breathed into her hair, the word a possessive, absolute claim. And then he went limp, his consciousness finally surrendering to his wounds. Alara was left alone in the snow-swept clearing, cradling the unconscious form of a dying king, a magical brand burning on her skin, and her entire world fractured beyond recognition. The blizzard raged around them, but for the first time in her life, she did not feel the cold. She only felt the terrifying, impossible warmth of the man in her arms. She had to do something. He was bleeding, his life draining away into the snow. The wound in his side was a dark, gaping maw. Panic gave way to a strange clarity. She couldn't move him. She couldn't stop the bleeding with her bare hands. But she couldn't just let him die. Laying him as gently as she could in the snow, she tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her already ruined tunic. It was a pathetic bandage for such a grievous wound, but it was all she had. As she pressed the cloth to his side, her hands became covered in his warm, sticky blood. And the mark on her wrist flared. It blazed with brilliant silver light, and the corresponding warmth flooded her hands. It was not a burning heat, but a gentle, life-giving warmth. Under her palms, she felt the flesh of his wound stitch itself together. She watched, wide-eyed with disbelief, as the torn muscle knitted, the skin sealed over, leaving behind only a thin, white scar where moments before there had been a fatal injury. The light faded, the warmth receded. He was healed. She stared at her hands, then at the mark on her wrist, then at the man's peaceful, sleeping face. What was she? What had she just done? The dormant thing inside her, the silent wolf she had always mourned, was not a wolf at all. It was this light. A new feeling began to dawn in her chest, pushing aside the fear. It was a fragile, tentative thing. Hope. Maybe she wasn't broken. Maybe she wasn't worthless. Maybe she was just different. The man in her arms stirred, his breathing deepening. The immediate danger had passed, but as the blizzard began to recede and the first gray hints of dawn touched the sky, a new and more insidious threat was already taking shape back at the Blackwood Pack stronghold. Lyra found her first. The battle with the rogues had been won, the survivors driven back into the forest. Now, search parties were combing the woods for the missing. Alara heard their calls and was about to answer when Lyra and two of her father's largest enforcers broke through the trees. Lyra's eyes widened at the scene. She saw Alara, dirty and disheveled, and the massive, unconscious man Alara was still hovering over protectively. But it was the silvery mark on Alara's wrist, stark against her skin in the morning light, that captured Lyra's full attention. A flicker of confusion crossed her face, followed by a dawning, greedy comprehension. She had seen such marks in the old texts, a soul bond, a claiming. And the man, even unconscious, radiated an aura of power that dwarfed anyone in their pack. This was no mere warrior. "Well, well," Lyra said, her voice soft and dangerous. "What has the little ghost found?" Alara scrambled to her feet, placing herself between Lyra and the unconscious man. "He's hurt," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I can see that," Lyra sneered, her eyes fixed on the mark. "And he's marked you. Who is he?" Alara didn't answer. She didn't know who he was, and even if she did, she wouldn't have told Lyra. A protective instinct, fierce and unfamiliar, had risen within her. This man was hers. The bond hummed in her veins, a silent affirmation of that impossible truth. Lyra's gaze turned cruel. "It doesn't matter. A claiming mark on an omega, on a broken, worthless stray. It's an abomination, a mistake." She turned to her enforcers. "Take her and bring him. My father will want to see this." The two large wolves shifted, their human forms melting away into sleek gray fur and snapping teeth. Alara backed away, her heart hammering. She had no way to fight them. "No," she said, the word a desperate plea. "Leave him alone." Lyra laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You are in no position to give orders, ghost." One of the wolves lunged, not for her, but for the man on the ground. Acting on pure instinct, Alara threw herself in the way. The wolf's momentum carried them both to the ground, its massive weight knocking the air from her lungs. Pain exploded in her shoulder as teeth grazed her skin, but she had protected him. The other wolf grabbed her by the scruff of her tunic and hauled her away, its grip bruising. She struggled, kicking and scratching, but it was useless. She was weak, powerless. The little spark of hope she had felt moments before was brutally extinguished. "Be careful with her," Lyra commanded, a sly, calculating look in her eyes. "She's valuable now. A perfect key." Key to what? Alara didn't understand. She watched in horror as they bound the unconscious man's hands with thick leather ropes and began to drag him back toward the stronghold. They threw her over the shoulder of one of the enforcers like a sack of grain. As they were dragged away from the clearing, a profound, aching cold began to seep back into her bones. It wasn't the winter air, it was the distance, the growing separation from him. The bond was screaming, a silent, agonizing shriek in her soul. She was a prisoner, and the man who was her fated mate, the king who had looked at her like she was a sunrise, was a captive beside her. The despair was a suffocating shroud, heavier and more complete than any she had ever known. They didn't take her to the servants' quarters. They threw her into the cold, damp cells beneath the main hall. The darkness was absolute, broken only by a thin sliver of light from under the heavy wooden door. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and misery. They tossed her onto the filthy, straw-covered floor, and the last thing she saw before the door boomed shut was Lyra's triumphant smirk. The pain started almost immediately. It was a deep, hollow ache in the center of her chest, a phantom limb that had been brutally amputated. It was the bond, stretched and strained by the distance in the cold stone walls. Every meter that separated them felt like a physical tear in her soul. She curled into a tight ball on the floor, wrapping her arms around her stomach as if to hold herself together. Where was he? What were they doing to him? The questions tormented her. This was her fault. If she hadn't found him, if she hadn't touched him, he would still be free. The old, familiar feelings of worthlessness came rushing back, stronger than ever. She had taken this powerful, magnificent being and dragged him down into her own pathetic world of pain and imprisonment. Hours, or maybe days, passed. Time had no meaning in the dark. They gave her water but no food. The ache in her chest intensified until it was a constant, burning agony. The silver mark on her wrist, once a source of wonder, now felt like a brand of shame. It pulsed with a dull, sickly light, mirroring her own despair. One day, the door creaked open. It was not Lyra, but her father, Alpha Marcus. He was a hard, grim man who had never given Alara more than a passing glance of contempt. Behind him stood a figure cloaked in shadow, a man who radiated a cold so profound it seemed to draw the very warmth from the air. "This is her," Marcus said, his voice holding a note of reverence that was directed at the stranger. "The one with the king's mark." The shadowed man stepped forward. He was tall and unnaturally thin, his face obscured by a deep hood, but Alara could feel the wrongness of him. A dark, corrupt power that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It was a chilling antithesis to the vibrant, life-affirming energies she'd felt from the golden-eyed king. "Show me," the man commanded, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. Marcus grabbed Alara's arm and shoved her forward. The man in the cloak reached out a long, pale hand and seized her wrist. His touch was like ice and decay. It sent a wave of nausea through her, and the mark on her skin fizzled, the silver light turning a tarnished gray. The bond shrieked in protest. "Yes," the man hissed, a sound of immense satisfaction. "It is the soul-fire bond, unmistakable. The Alpha King is truly vulnerable." He released her, and she stumbled back, rubbing her wrist, trying to wipe away the feeling of his dead touch. "Lord Vorlag," Marcus said, bowing his head slightly. "The Ember Covenant will have what it desires. We have the king, and we have his key." So that was his name. Lord Vorlag, the Shadow King, leader of the dark cult that sought to usurp the true shifter monarchies. And Alpha Marcus was his pawn, willing to betray his own kind for a taste of power. Lyra had not seen a mistake. She had seen an opportunity to use Alara to break the most powerful shifter in the world. Vorlag turned his hooded gaze on her. "Such a pathetic little vessel for such a grand destiny," he mused. "He waited centuries for you? A broken Omega who cannot even call her own wolf. The irony is exquisite. His words were meant to hurt, and they did. They struck the core of her deepest insecurities. But hearing them from this creature, this vessel of darkness, sparked something else. The ember of defiance that had kept her alive for so long flickered. "What do you want with him?" she asked, her voice trembling but clear. Vorlag seemed amused by her question. "Want? I want everything, little mouse. I want his throne, his power, his world. And you are the tool I will use to shatter his will. The bond works both ways. Your pain is his pain. Your despair will be his undoing. We will sever this bond in a ritual, and the psychic backlash will leave him a hollow, broken shell, ripe for my conquest." The cold dread that filled her was absolute. They were going to use her to destroy him, to torture him through their connection. The thought of her pain, her weakness, being used as a weapon against him was more than she could bear. She had to fight. But how? She was locked in a cell, weak from hunger, her spirit nearly crushed. After they left, plunging her back into darkness, she sank to the floor, the full weight of her hopelessness pressing down on her. Vorlag was right. She was pathetic, a worthless stray, a mistake. She was going to be the death of the only person who had ever looked at her and seen something more. She wept then, not quiet, shameful tears, but great, racking sobs of utter despair that tore through her throat. She cried for him, for the loss of a future she had barely dared to imagine, for the beautiful, terrible hope he had ignited in her, only for it to be turned into an instrument of his destruction. In the depths of that despair, as her consciousness began to fray, she felt a flicker, a tiny spark in the crushing darkness of the bond. It was a pinprick of warmth in the icy agony. "Hold on." The voice was not a sound. It was a thought, a feeling, projected directly into her mind. It was his voice, the deep thunder she remembered but strained, filled with its own pain. Her sobs hitched. Was she imagining it? Alara. He knew her name. How could he know her name? She hadn't told him. "I know you. I have always known you. Hold on. I am coming." The connection was faint, a thread stretched taut across a vast and painful distance, but it was real. He was alive. He was fighting. He was thinking of her. He was coming for her. The knowledge was a lifeline. It did not erase her fear or her pain, but it gave her a reason to endure it. The stubborn ember within her, which had dwindled to a near-smothered coal, glowed anew. He had asked her to hold on, and so she would. She would not let Vorlag break her. She would endure anything, so long as that fragile thread of connection remained. She would be his anchor, not his downfall. The ritual was to take place in the great hall, the same hall she had scrubbed on her hands and knees. They dragged her from the cell, her legs weak and unsteady. The hall was transformed. Dark tapestries bearing the sigil of the Ember Covenant, a serpent eating a star, hung from the walls. Black candles cast long, dancing shadows. In the center of the room, a circle of runes had been painted on the floor in what looked disturbingly like fresh blood. And there, chained to a great stone throne that had replaced the Alpha's seat, was him, Kalen. She knew his name now, whispered into her soul through the bond. He was battered and bruised. His face was pale beneath the dark stubble, but his eyes, when they met hers, burned with the same molten gold. They were filled with a furious, protective rage that was directed not at his captors, but at the sight of her own suffering. Heavy chains, forged of what she now recognized as magic-dampening silver, bound him to the throne. Lyra was there, standing beside Vorlag like a proud princess, her face alight with vicious triumph. Alpha Marcus stood grimly behind them, his face a mask of conflicted ambition. They forced Alara to her knees in the center of the blood-painted circle. Vorlag began to chant in a guttural, ancient language, the words twisting the air, making the candlelight flicker and wane. The runes on the floor began to glow with a sickly red light. A new kind of pain erupted from the mark on her wrist. It was a vile, corrosive agony, as if acid were being poured directly into her veins. It was the ritual, actively trying to poison and sever the bond. She screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure torment. Across the room, Kaelin roared. The sound was not human. It was the rage of a god, a force of nature that shook the very foundations of the hall. He strained against his silver chains, the metal groaning and creaking, his muscles bulging with impossible strength. The golden light in his eyes intensified until it was almost blinding. "Stop!" he bellowed, his voice raw with his own reflected agony. "Leave her alone!" Vorlag only laughed, his chanting growing louder, more feverish. "Feel it, great king. Feel your soul being torn apart through this worthless vessel. This is the price of your sentiment." Worthless. The word echoed in the chamber. The same word that had defined her entire existence. She looked at Kaelin, at the pain contorting his beautiful, harsh face. Pain he was feeling because of her. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the frantic struggle to reach her, and something inside her snapped. It was not a surrender. It was a rebellion. A volcanic eruption of every suppressed injustice, every moment of humiliation, every ounce of pain she had ever endured. Vorlag was wrong. Lyra was wrong. They were all wrong. Kaelin had not looked at her and seen a worthless vessel. He had looked at her and seen her. He had waited for her. The silver mark on her wrist, which had been flickering with poisoned red light, suddenly blazed with a pure, white-hot fire. It was not the gentle warmth of her healing touch. This was the light of a star being born. It was rage and love and a desperate, defiant will to protect what was hers. A wave of pure energy, of blinding white light exploded from her. It hit the runic circle like a thunderclap. The blood runes vaporized, the dark magic shattering into nothingness. The wave expanded, slamming into Vorlag and his acolytes, throwing them back as if struck by a physical blow. The black candles were extinguished, plunging the room into a momentary darkness that was immediately banished by the incandescent glow radiating from Alara herself. She rose to her feet, no longer a shivering, pathetic girl, but a column of divine fire. The light poured from her, a living, breathing entity. It was the soul light, her hidden power now fully, cataclysmically awake. Vorlag staggered to his feet, his hood thrown back. His face was a pale, skeletal horror, his eyes pits of shadow. He stared at her, not with amusement but with disbelief and a flicker of genuine fear. "Impossible," he hissed. "An Omega cannot wield the soul light." "I am not an Omega," Alara said, and her voice was no longer a whisper. It rang through the hall with the clarity of a silver bell and the power of a storm. It was her voice, her true voice. "And you will not touch him." Before anyone could react, the great doors of the hall were blasted inward, exploding into a shower of splinters and ice. Through the opening stormed a phalanx of warriors, clad in black and silver, their eyes glowing with predatory light. At their head was a giant of a man with a silver-streaked beard, who took one look at the scene and let out a howl of pure fury. Kalen's beta. His pack had arrived. The hall erupted into a maelstrom of battle. Kalen's warriors, the legendary Dire Guard, clashed with the Ember Covenant cultists and the traitorous Blackwood wolves. The sound was deafening, a clang of steel and the snarls of shifting forms. But Alara only had eyes for two people. Kalen, still chained to the throne, and Vorlag, who was now advancing on her, his shadowy magic coalescing around his hands like writhing serpents. "You will be extinguished, little light," Vorlag snarled, lunging at her. Alara didn't flinch. She raised a hand, and a beam of pure, concentrated light shot from her palm. It struck Vorlag in the chest. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony as the light burned him, his shadow magic dissolving like smoke in the sun. He was thrown backward, crashing into the stone throne beside Kalen. Kalen, seeing his chance, put every ounce of his remaining strength into one final, desperate heave. With a screech of tortured metal, the silver chain binding his right arm snapped. He was free. In a blur of motion, he was off the throne. He grabbed Vorlag by the throat, lifting the Shadow King off the ground with one hand. The gold in his eyes was a raging inferno. "You touched what was mine," Kalen growled, his voice a low promise of death. There was a sickening crack of bone, and Vorlag's body went limp. Kalen dropped him to the floor like a discarded rag. The source of the darkness was gone. The fighting in the hall faltered as the Ember Covenant cultists felt their master's death. Their dark power vanished, leaving them exposed and terrified. The Dire Guard made short work of them. Lyra and her father were quickly subdued, their faces masks of shocked defeat. But all of that was just noise in the background. Kalen turned, his gaze finding Alara across the ruined hall. The divine light was still pouring from her, but it softened as he approached, the rage giving way to an overwhelming relief. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate, his golden eyes filled with an emotion so profound, so full of love and awe, that it made her knees weak. He stopped in front of her, his expression tender. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "My queen," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The light receded, flowing back into her until she was just herself again, standing in the center of the chaos, her heart pounding. Tears welled in her eyes, but these were not tears of fear or despair. They were tears of release. "I thought," she started, her voice catching. "I thought you were—" "You saved me," he finished for her, his voice soft but absolute. "You saved us both." He pulled her against him, wrapping his powerful arms around her and holding her tight. She buried her face in his chest, inhaling his scent of pine and winter storms, and finally let herself feel safe. His arms were a fortress around her. The bond between them flared, no longer a source of pain, but a vibrant, joyful current of warmth and connection. It sang in her veins. He held her there for a long time, in the dark of the ruined hall, until the last of her shivers subsided. She did not cry. She had no more tears of sorrow left to shed. His beta, the silver-bearded warrior whose name she would learn was Gunnar, approached them cautiously. "My king," he said, his voice rough with respect as he bowed his head. His eyes flickered to Alara, full of wonder. Kalen didn't release her. He kept one arm wrapped securely around her waist, anchoring her to his side. "The traitors?" he asked, his voice returning to that of a commander. "Secured, Alpha King," Gunnar reported. "Marcus and his daughter are in chains. They will face the High Council's justice. Kalen nodded, his gaze softening as he looked down at Alara. We're going home, he said to her, his voice a quiet promise. Home. The word was foreign, alien. She had never had a home. He seemed to understand her silent confusion. He lifted her hand, the one with the silvery mark, and pressed a kiss to it. The mark glowed with a warm, gentle light, and for the first time, she saw a matching mark blaze into existence on the back of his own hand, a mirror image of hers. The bond was complete, accepted, and claimed by both of them. Home is with me, he stated simply, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. They walked out of the Blackwood Pack's hall, leaving the darkness and betrayal behind them. Outside, the sun was rising, casting the snow-covered mountains in hues of pink and gold. The air was clean and cold. Kalen's warriors, the Dire Guard, were assembled in the courtyard. They stood straight and silent, their gazes fierce. As Kalen emerged with Alara at his side, every single one of them, to a man, dropped to one knee. Alara froze, her breath catching in her throat. They were kneeling. For him, yes, but also for her. Their eyes were on her, filled not with scorn or pity, but with a deep, unwavering reverence. They were looking at their queen. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a flicker of the old uncertainty. Who was she to be a queen? She was just Alara, the ghost, the Omega. Kalen squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking the new mark on her skin. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. You are the other half of my soul, he murmured, his voice for her alone. You are the light in my darkness. You are everything. She looked up at him, into his molten gold eyes, and saw her own reflection. She didn't see a worthless, broken girl. She saw a woman who had survived, a woman who had fought back, a woman who held the power of a star inside her, a woman who was loved completely and unconditionally by the most powerful man in their world. A genuine smile touched her lips, perhaps for the first time in a decade. It felt new and wonderful. He smiled back, that devastating sunrise of a smile, and it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with magic. It was simply love, pure and profound. He led her through the kneeling warriors, toward the future, toward a new life, toward home. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer worthless. She was Alara, the soul light, mate to the Alpha King. She was seen, and she would never, ever be a ghost again.